Encourage every single one of you to buy a hat or some other type of merchandise while you're back there. We've got all kinds of styles, and it's really great not only for you to wear our merchandise, but to advertise our work and maybe to be a conversation starter and encourage other people to get involved with what we're doing. So get a magnet, get a hat, and promote our brand. We really appreciate it. With that, I'll turn it back over to John.
Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Timothy Shannon is a professor of history at Gettysburg College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He teaches primarily early American, Native American, and British history. His books include Indian Captive, Indian King, Peter Williamson in America and Britain, and the 7 Years' War in North America, Brief History with Documents. At the National Army Museum, where I'm on the staff, we had him at a virtual conference several years back on colonial conflicts, but this is the first opportunity to have him in person. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Shannon.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to John very much for the invitation to come talk to you today at this conference. I very much appreciate the fact teaching at Gettysburg whenever we get a chance to talk about the 7 Years' War or American Revolution as opposed to the American Civil War. And so I'm very happy to be here. What I want to talk to you about today is the ways in which, one of the ways in which the 7 Years' War illustrated the contrast between Native American ways of war and European ways of war. As you've already heard from multiple speakers here, you know, this war is qualitatively different because it does bring these large European armies with new rules of war to North America. And that's especially apparent in the practice of captivity. What happens to enemies who are captured as a result of military engagements. The British perception of Indian warfare going back to the 17th century with the arrival of the first colonists in Virginia and New England was that Indians fought like they hunted, that they practiced what the English called the skulking way of war. They relied on ambushes and surprise tactics. They attacked civilian populations that were isolated homesteads or communities out on the frontier. They engaged in the murder and mutilation of civilians, including women and children, and they would carry off captives from these surprise engagements to face torture and execution back in their villages. Certainly by the early 18th century, the perception among British colonists was that the French, even though they were fellow Christians of the British, were complicit in this Indian warfare by not only supplying their Indian allies, but giving them tacit encouragement to go out and engage in these sorts of activities that were in violation of the supposedly more civilized European rules of war. And closely related to this perception of Indian warfare was the emergence of a new literary genre in colonial America of the Indian captivity narrative. And these are important sources for those of us who study the era of colonial wars. First-person accounts of being taken captive by Native Americans and describing kind of the trials and tribulations endured by civilians during this captivity. The most famous expression of these captivity stories in American literature has already been alluded to several times this morning, and that is James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. I agree with John's assessment. It's not so great a read, but it is a great film, and it has come to encapsulate kind of our perception, the popular American imagination of what Native American warfare was like. The British, on the other hand, described themselves as practicing a more civilized kind of warfare, and we see that depicted in the 7 Years' War with the arrival of these British and French officers, people like Montcalm, people like Amherst and Wolfe, and these other leaders, that they practiced fighting in open battle, linear tactics, siegecraft, making use of artillery and trenches and so forth, that warfare was something engaged in between uniformed combatants, and that when prisoners were taken, the rules of war dictated that they be treated in a humane way, repatriated as quickly as possible. And so captivity does become one of these ways of contrasting supposedly the savage warfare of Native Americans with the civilized warfare of Europeans. In my study of captivity during this era, I found that image is often contradictory. In fact, Indian captivity could be quite humane in the way that we use the term today, and being taken as a prisoner of war and held as a prisoner of war according to the rules of European warfare could be quite inhumane in some ways. And so I want to illustrate that contrast for you today by talking about the fall of Oswego, Fort Oswego in 1756, which we've heard about already this morning, and then talking about one captive in particular from that conflict, a fellow named Peter Williamson, who you've probably never heard of before, but I think you'll find him a very intriguing character who illustrates these contrasts. So let's start by just talking very briefly about European and Indian warfare before the 7 Years' War. In the 17th century, warfare tended to be fought on a much smaller scale than we've heard about in the 7 Years' War today. Primarily colonial militias and Native American warriors engaging in raids and reprisals, oftentimes along these kind of frontier borderlands, particularly between New England and New York and French Canada. In these conflicts, each side has its own rules about what to do with captured enemies. The English typically sold Indian captives into slavery or put them to the sword, and this was very common in both the southern colonies and in the New England colonies. By the late 17th century, English colonial governments are offering scalp bounties to incentivize the killing of Indians rather than taking them captive. And so there is not a tradition of holding Indians as prisoners of war or as captives in the British colonies. Native American warriors usually killed the wounded and dying when they engaged in these conflicts. But those survivors that they took captive who were capable of moving, they took with them into captivity and forced them to accompany them, oftentimes on very long marches, back to their native villages, where some might be subjected to torture and execution. Mostly those would be adult males who faced that fate. Others might be enslaved or adopted as kin. That would typically be children or young women of reproductive age. Others, they would ransom to colonial officials or to family members who paid for their return with trade goods. And certainly by the time of the 7 Years' War, there had developed this economy of captivity in French Canada, in which a captive, if he or she survived being taken captive by French allied Indians and was brought into Canada, would have a reasonable expectation of ultimately being ransomed back to his or her family as a result of payment of trade goods and perhaps a period of servitude in Canada before they were eventually redeemed. Captivity narratives are a part of the American colonial story from the very start. If you've read the story about Captain John Smith and Pocahontas in early Jamestown, that's a very good example of an early Indian captivity story, John Smith's captivity, that really has precedence going all the way back to the Crusades, into experiences with the Barbary nations of the north coast of Africa. These were stories about Christians being held captive, typically by Muslims in North Africa or by the Turks in the eastern Mediterranean. And Captain John Smith, when he writes about his captivity among the Powhatan Indians, is really just adopting the tropes of those earlier captivity stories. Christians held in bondage, facing torture, enslavement, and so forth, and finally escaping. But the genre of the captivity narrative in early America is especially associated with the New England Puritans. The captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson is published in 1682 in Boston. It is the first full-length captivity narrative to appear in British North America, and it is kind of the one that sets the content and expectations of the genre as it will exist for the next 50 to 70 years. You see an image of her narrative here, but you should note that the one that I show you there that shows this female figure shouldering a musket and firing back at Indians who are storming her homestead, that is an edition that was published in 1773, so almost a full century after, which tells you something about the enduring popularity of Mary Rowlandson's story. It originates in King Philip's War in the 1670s, but it goes through multiple editions during the 18th century. And then next to it, you see another captivity narrative by the Reverend John Norton that was published in 1748, just a few years before the 7 Years' War breaks out. What these captivity narratives have in common is that they typically feature a female protagonist, like Mary Rowlandson. Some of them do have male protagonists, but oftentimes the captive whose story is being told is a woman. And they often describe captivity as both a physical trial, enduring hunger, enduring exposure, enduring beatings from their Indian captors, but also describing captivity as a spiritual struggle. Captivity is a providential affliction sent by God to awaken the kind of the slumbering faith of the captive, and during this time of prolonged physical trial to test that person's faith, and then ultimately restore that person both physical redemption, return to family, return to community, but also a kind of spiritual redemption, to have been tested by God and to have persevered in your Christian beliefs and ultimately be rewarded by God for doing that. And so there's a real kind of spiritual dimension to these captivity narratives. As you might imagine, captives typically compare themselves to Job in the story of Job in the Old Testament as a faithful believer in God who is being tested by him. Oftentimes they did talk about what happened to these captives when they were brought back to Canada. Many of them were ransomed by their Indian captors to either French priests who worked closely with the Indian warriors or by the French governor. And then they would endure a period of servitude in Canada where they basically paid off that ransom to the French officials or priests who had redeemed them, and while negotiations went on with their families back home to redeem them. Sometimes, this is especially true of youngsters, of children or young women, they might be married off into the local communities among either natives or French men. Children would face catechism from French priests who would try to convince them to convert to Catholicism, convince them of the errors of their ways. And that was another dimension of this spiritual trial, that you might actually adjure your Protestant faith and go over to the Catholic side. But an element of these captivity narratives oftentimes was the gradual realization, once the shock of captivity was over, that in fact natives who took these captives would oftentimes treat them kindly. And so a common trope was kind of the surprise of suddenly realizing that perhaps Indian captivity wasn't going to result in murder, maiming, and torture and so forth, but in fact Indians could treat their captives well. And so this is from the narrative of the Reverend John Norton, who's one of about 30 captives taken from Fort Massachusetts in western Massachusetts during King George's War. And I just picked out a couple of quotes here that kind of illustrate this surprise and good treatment from his Indian captors. We set out again and had gone but a little way before we came upon Josiah Reed, who gave out. In other words, he was exhausted on the trail. He couldn't move any further. I expected they would have knocked him on the head and killed him, but an Indian carried him on his back. So this Indian actually carries this fellow who can't go any further on the trail. And then in another instance, I had the comfort to see the greatest part of the prisoners come up. God having wonderfully strengthened many who were weak, the French carrying the women. Mrs. Smead was taken in travail. In other words, she was pregnant and about to give birth. And some of the French made a seat for her to sit upon and brought her to the camp, where about 10 o'clock she was graciously delivered of a daughter and was remarkably well. This morning I baptized John Smead's child. He called its name Captivity. You know, what a wonderfully evocative image of this child being born on the route, the march back into Canada, and the child being named Captivity. So nor is surprise here at the good treatment that the Indian captors and the French captors are giving to his countrymen is genuine. And it reflects the fact that this economy of captivity, these captives are going to be worth money when they get back to Canada. And so preserving the life of a pregnant woman, preserving the life of an adult man who's exhausted himself on the trail does have real material benefits. Things changed during the 7 Years' War, in part because of the importation of new rules with these European armies about what to do with prisoners of war. And so now I want to turn our attention to the siege of Fort Oswego, which we've heard about earlier today. It's on the southeastern shore of Lake Ontario. It is a fort that has a force of about 1,100 provincial soldiers, about 1,100 colonial soldiers who are there, and about another 300 or so civilians, military contractors, camp followers, family members of these soldiers. And in 1756, the fort is surrounded by a French and Indian force led by Montcalm, the French general, and it comes under siege. And it falls very, very quickly. In fact, the fort falls so quickly to the French force that Montcalm refuses the garrison the traditional honors of war. You know, when you have nobly defended your position and you finally surrender, the conquering army will offer the soldiers the honors of war. And the most important element of the honors of war is parole. All right, officers are discharged if they promise not to participate in the conflict again, in that particular theater of the conflict. Soldiers are allowed to keep their arms and basically go home. Right? But Montcalm is not willing to give the honors of war to this garrison because they have not put up a particularly strong defense. And instead, in the Articles of Capitulation, he mandates that they will be taken as prisoners of war and will be marched back into Canada. Now, he's also part of his army is a contingent of Indian warriors who have come with him and who are looking for captives and looking for scalps and other trophies of war. And so after the Articles of Capitulation are signed, there is a conflict between the British prisoners and the Indian allies who attacked the British prisoners. It's something that anticipates what happens a year later at Fort William Henry, but only on a smaller scale. And it's very interesting to read the eyewitness accounts of what goes on here, because the British, of course, call it a massacre that happens after the surrender of the fort. But the French are much more guarded in describing what goes on. What we do know is that the French, in an effort to protect the British who had surrendered, order them into the stockade of the fort. But while the British are moving into the stockade of the fort, they also break into the rum stores, as it happened at Fort Necessity, and in anticipation of being attacked by the Indians, many of them drink to excess, you know, expecting that this is going to ease their situation as they face imminent death. The Indians also break into the rum stores that are being kept here, and many of them imbibe as well. And so what the French sources describe is basically a drunken melee that develops between the Indian warriors who are seeking captives and the English whose discipline breaks down very, very quickly. And these are a couple of descriptions of what happened. Stephen Cross was a Massachusetts carpenter, a military contractor who was among the prisoners. And he clearly blames what happened on the soldiers. Our drunken soldiers continued their noise, and the Indians their struggles and yelling, until the operations of the liquor, together with the strong exertions, began to dispose both parties to sleep. Basically they exhaust themselves in this. And then Colonel Littlehales, who was the British commander who negotiated the surrender, after the capitulation, some of them, meaning his soldiers, having gone into liquor, fell into wrangling with the Indians, and several of them were killed, but the number as yet is uncertain. Now, according to the French sources, approximately 100 of the prisoners were killed as a result of this drunken melee that broke out. There are two references in English sources to Indians taking captives from among the surrendered garrison. One British officer claimed that Montcalm handed over 20 soldiers from New Jersey to the Indians to compensate them for their losses in the battle, and he implied that they were tortured and executed. A British captive named Robert Eastburn, he was an Indian captive, another military contractor who had been taken captive by Indians and was living in Montreal when the prisoners of war came through town. He claimed that 15 young lads from among the civilian POWs were handed over to the Indians to fill up the number that they had lost in battle. So these are two different eyewitness accounts, but both claiming the same thing, that in essence the French handed over 15 to 20 captives to the Indians for them to do with what they wanted. So if you put yourself in the shoes of these Oswego prisoners after the fall of the fort as they're being marched into Canada, and you had a choice here. Of course, they didn't have a choice, but imagine you had a choice. Would you want to be a prisoner of war under the protection of these French officers and soldiers who were marching you into Canada? Or would you want to be among this much smaller group of captives who are handed over to Native Americans, perhaps for torture and execution, perhaps for adoption? I think everybody in this room would probably say, well, I want to be a prisoner of war. I want to be treated according to European rules that will govern the treatment of prisoners of war. But what happens to these prisoners in many respects is counterintuitive to answering that question. So let's talk a little bit about the fate of these prisoners in Canada. They are marched into Canada. One British officer notes that it is a custom among the Indians to buffet prisoners on their arrival. In other words, to make them run the gauntlet. And our Mohawks use their prisoners in the same manner. To do justice to the French, no people take greater care of sick and wounded men than they do. So he's saying, not so bad. The French are treating particularly our sick and wounded well. And then another reference from Colonel Littlehales: since our arrival at this place, meaning Montreal, we have been treated with all imaginable politeness, and I have no reason to doubt that it continues. So the French appear to be treating their prisoners very well. The story is a little different if you're a civilian. The French are not as interested in protecting civilians. There are accounts among the civilians who are moving with these prisoners, French soldiers trying to rape English women, or Indian warriors who are killing stragglers and taking their scalps. When they move finally to Quebec, that is when trouble begins to start for these prisoners, because they are confined to a military barracks in Quebec that becomes overcrowded very quickly. And there's a shortage of food in Canada during this time as well. So now the prisoners are facing the prospects of hunger and they are facing the prospects of disease that will invariably break out when they are crowded together in these very unsanitary conditions. This is from Stephen Cross, the Massachusetts military contractor. We continued here and were well treated as prisoners, especially by the old gentleman who was the keeper of the prison and who conducted towards us more like a father than an enemy. We were generally healthy while here. Some few had sickness, which were carried to the hospital and on recovery were returned to us. This is very different than what had happened with the Fort Massachusetts prisoners that we talked about before. More than half of them died during their time of confinement in this military barracks because of disease that broke out among them. With the Oswego prisoners, though, this is such a large influx of prisoners that it becomes apparent very quickly that the French are not going to be able to guard them and feed them in Quebec. So very quickly, arrangements are made to exchange them. But the problem is the British have no French prisoners of war in North America yet. And so these prisoners are going to be put on ships and sent back across the Atlantic to either England or France to await exchange there. And this is where things go sideways for these prisoners. The Atlantic passages, as you might imagine, are on very overcrowded ships that are mixing both Indian captives with prisoners of war who are being shipped out of Quebec. So Stephen Cross, of the 140 prisoners of war which were confined together in the hold of his ship, 70 were soldiers of Shirley's regiment, which had been enlisted in some of the southern provinces of Scotch, Irish, and English, and by their manners and behavior, we suppose were convicts transported from their own country. And with these, we had not the best agreement. Fighting breaks out between these soldiers who had been recruited in the southern colonies, who this New Englander is considering to be former convicts transported to the colonies, and some of the civilian prisoners on board the ship. Another observation from his journal. One of our unhappy companions was a young man belonging to New Jersey. The New Jersey soldiers were there, who had left home a wife and a child, and was so overborne in his mind with our danger that his reason gave way and became delirious, and would suddenly start at a heavy surge of the sea and cry out, "The ship is sinking, and our friends will never know our unhappy fate." This delirium increased on him the remainder of the voyage, and after we were landed, he lost his reason totally and went raving distracted. So I think today we would say this prisoner was suffering from PTSD and had a mental breakdown on board the ship while they were being carried back. So these prisoners ended up on these very long, extended odysseys back to Europe. Like I said, some landed in England, some landed in France. The soldiers were eventually, their regiments were broken while they were in England. The embarrassment on Oswego was so bad that the 50th and 51st regiments were broken, and the soldiers were drafted into the 1st Regiment of Foot, which at the time was preparing to return, to ship out to America. And so a lot of the soldiers returned to America, but many of them weakened by smallpox and dysentery and other diseases from their Atlantic passage. Some of them were discharged in England because of disability. For those civilian prisoners, people like Stephen Cross, it was much harder because the Admiralty Office, which oversaw the exchange of prisoners, did not consider itself responsible for these civilian prisoners of war who were now in France or in England. And so typically they found themselves penniless and without means of returning home. And in some cases they encountered extended stays in England as they awaited an opportunity to return home. And when they finally did get home, they often were penniless when they arrived. Robert Eastburn, who had been this civilian contractor living in Quebec as an Indian captive, he had actually joined the Oswego prisoners, ended up in Europe, and by the time he shipped back to Boston, in order to get back to Philadelphia, his home, he has no money, and he basically has to rely on the kindness of strangers will help him as he eventually makes his way home. Clearly, he would have preferred to have stayed in Montreal and eventually been redeemed through the process of Indian captivity than the fate he faced as one of these prisoners of war. And so when I ask you that question of which would you have preferred, to be an Indian captive or a prisoner of war, like I said, I imagine most of us would say we would have preferred to be an a prisoner of war. But in fact, I think the prisoners of war, because of these rules of repatriation, because of enduring these transatlantic voyages and the exposure to disease and hunger and so forth, in fact, their suffering was prolonged compared to the Indian captives, whose likelihood of being ransomed and returning home within a year were much, much higher. So that's the fate of the Oswego prisoners, and with my remaining time, I want to tell you a little bit more about one in particular, and that's this fellow, Peter Williamson, whose captivity narrative you see here. Williamson led a very interesting life. Williamson was from Aberdeen, Scotland, and he had come to Pennsylvania as an indentured servant in the 1740s. By the time that the French and Indian War broke out, he had gained his freedom, and like many former servants, was basically working as an agricultural laborer in the greater Philadelphia area, and he enlisted in the British Army, which did attract a lot of former servants, in some cases runaway servants, who were just looking for an opportunity to get out, of a bad situation. So he enlisted in Shirley's regiment, the 50th Regiment, and he was at Oswego in 1756 when it fell. And he was on the first cartel ship that sent these prisoners of war back to England. They landed in Plymouth on the southern coast of England. He was disbanded, he was discharged from the army because he had been wounded during his service. And he was penniless. He had to find his way home to Aberdeen, Scotland. And so for the next year, he made his way back to his native Aberdeen. But the way he chose to do so was very interesting. He published his captivity narrative, French and Indian Cruelty, exemplified in the life and various vicissitudes of fortune of Peter Williamson, a disbanded soldier. And he took to dressing up in Indian costume and displaying himself in taverns and coffee houses as a way of selling his narrative, telling his story, and financing his way back to Aberdeen. And he found, very interestingly, that there were a lot of disbanded soldiers in Britain who were generally described as desperados, desperate characters who might turn to a life of petty crime and so forth. And so in order to garner public sympathy, he said not only was he a disbanded soldier, but he was also a former Indian captive. And he told the story of being held captive by Delaware Indians in Pennsylvania on the eve of the 7 Years' War. He told a very convincing story about this captivity. The interesting thing about it, it was entirely made up. He fabricated his Indian captivity story. He made it the centerpiece. Oh, sure. So he fabricated. Okay. Oh, wow, there we go. Okay. Sorry, folks. I'm not going to start over. But he fabricates this Indian captivity story because he wants to garner public sympathy for his plight, and he's very successful in doing it. His captivity narrative is never published in its entirety in North America, but in Britain, it goes through 6 editions in 10 years, from 1757 to 1766. It is published in York, England, in London, in Edinburgh, Scotland, in Glasgow, Scotland, and in Dublin, Ireland. And it's published in all those places because he's traveling through the British Isles, telling his story, and printing new editions as necessary in order to sell in those markets. This is an image of him that appears in a London magazine when he comes to London to tell his story. And it describes him in the dress of a Delaware Indian, and it depicts in the background images from his captivity story, which is a very lurid, very sensationalized, very bloody story about torture and scalping, Indian bushfighting. He describes the rape of 2 different female captives in his story as well. In other words, there is nothing devotional about this captivity narrative. This is not the New England style narrative emphasizing the spiritual trials and the recommitment of a Christian to his or her life of faith. This is anticipating the type of captivity narratives that will be published during the American Revolution and then during the early 19th century, in which captives tend to be male figures as opposed to female figures, and that these captives endure all sorts of bloody tortures and witness all sorts of Indian mayhem that is being committed on the frontier, including the sexual violation of European women, and then ultimately, by escaping their captivity, become Indian fighters themselves. Learn from their time as captives how to fight like Indians, how to track Indians, and therefore, when they are redeemed out of their captivities, become Indian fighters. And Williamson tells these stories. He kind of frames his military service in the 7 Years' War as a desire for revenge against the Indians who had supposedly taken him captive. And this, I think, is very interesting, because if you do read American Indian captivity narratives, the 7 Years' War does mark a change in how these captivity narratives tell their stories. The devotional elements, the religious elements of the New England era captivity narratives recede very quickly into the background, and it anticipates what in the 19th century they call the blood and thunders, these stories about Indian warfare, detailing in increasingly lurid detail the bloodiness of fighting Indians and then going out and seeking revenge on them. I think Williamson's captivity narrative very much anticipates Daniel Boone's captivity narrative from the era of the American Revolution, which is published in 1784 and is very widely read and becomes kind of the model for the post-revolutionary captivity narratives in American society. And for those of you who are fans of American Westerns, who've seen The Searchers, the great John Wayne, John Ford film from 1956, I think Williamson in some ways is kind of the model for the character that John Wayne plays in this film, Ethan Edwards, who is spending, The Searchers is the story of him searching for his niece who's been taken captive by Comanche Indians on the Texas frontier. And he himself, what makes this such a great film is he's a very mysterious character. And it's never stated outright, but the implication is that he himself is a former Indian captive. That the reason he knows how to speak Comanche, the reason he knows the Comanche so well and can track them for 5 years to find his niece is because he is a former captive who now has become this great Indian hater and Indian fighter. And Williamson's, I think, is the first model of that in the captivity genre, of the Indian captive turned Indian fighter. There's a lot more I could say here, but we are limited in time. And so for my last slide, I do just want to put up some titles here. If this is a topic that interests you, if you are interested in learning more about the Indian captivity genre, if you want to read some original captivity narratives, or you're interested in how the genre changes over time, I've just thrown up some titles here. The Colin Calloway and the Alden Vaughan and Edward Clark books are both collections of captivity narratives, very enjoyable, based on the New England captivity narratives. Anne Little's book is about a young female captive from New England who ultimately becomes a French Catholic nun in Canada, so a story of adoption and conversion to Catholic faith. Ian Steele's book is the most comprehensive account of captivity narratives from this region, the Allegheny region, in the period of the 7 Years' War. It's a really wonderful work. Len Travers' book is about a group of captives taken during the 7 Years' War in the Lake Champlain Valley theater of the war, which we've heard a lot about today. In my book on Peter Williamson, tells you much more about his very fascinating story. So feel free to follow up with any of these titles if I've whetted your appetite. I do think we have some time for some questions, right, John? So, I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Yeah, I have two questions. One was the treatment of prisoners of war different before the 7 Years' War with the non-professional European armies, and then my second was the European rules of engagement with non-European civilizations transferred those POWs.
Sure. So the question concerns the treatment of prisoners of war before the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War definitely changes it, yes. Because for the first time you have these armies numbering in the thousands of soldiers. And so when the Oswego prisoners of war are taken, 1,100 soldiers, you know, that is the single largest group of prisoners of war that have been taken in North America up to that time. And so this is something new under the sun. Generally speaking, before the 7 Years' War, in North America, the understanding was that fellow Christians would help redeem fellow Christians out of Indian captivity. So regardless of whether they were enemies, in wartime and so forth, they would help redeem Christians out of captivity among heathens. All right. In terms of the exchange of, say, Spanish prisoners of war, English prisoners of war, there just wasn't a lot of that going on because there was so little direct fighting between uniformed troops. And so really the fate of, if you were a prisoner of war before the 7 Years' War, most likely you were an Indian captive, rather than a captive of another European power. And was there a second part of your question?
Yeah, did the European rules of engagement during this period of time ever apply to non-Christian?
Yeah, not typically. It's interesting. There is, among these accounts of these cartel ships that sail from Canada back to Europe, there are a couple references to Indians who end up on these cartel ships. One is to an Indian woman who's been married to, I think, an English soldier who has died. And so she's kind of thrown in with these civilian prisoners, but her name, the reference to her comes up because, back in England, they don't know what to do with her, right? Because she's not a soldier. And she's one of these people who I think just ends up an object of charity among people as she's trying to find her way back. But typically, non-Christians were not accorded this type of treatment. And like I said, the English in the late 17th and early 18th century, the most typical fate for an Indian who was taken alive in a military engagement was to be sold into slavery and to be exported to the West Indies to labor on a sugar plantation. Yes, sir.
Are there cases of indentured servants or African-American slaves who were captured and brought to Canada and then exchanged their allegiance for freedom and stayed in Canada?
A lot of indentured servants do run away and join the British Army during the 7 Years' War. As was referenced, I think, last night during David Preston's talk. British recruiting officers are not especially picky. And in fact, colonial officials protest mightily that the British are not doing enough to return runaway servants to their masters, to prevent them from joining these forces. And think about it, right? If you want to run away, the army is a good thing to do because it's mobile and it moves and it moves quickly. And so a lot of servants do that. And I'm not aware of any being returned to their masters. I think once they are part of this group, they are, they're soldiers now. and they are shipped back as repatriated soldiers and then assigned to new regiments. With runaway slaves, that's a very good question. I have no doubt that some African Americans end up recruited into British arms, but again, it's not because of the offer of freedom. It's just that they are warm bodies that a British recruiting officer is happy to have, mustered in. Yes?
We talked about militia during the discussion here. Now, were they given any compensation? Because they must have been all single men, mostly, because why would they leave their families, and if they had property, who was maintaining them?
Yeah, so, I think the militias served primarily as kind of the recruiting pool for the provincial armies, right? And so when Massachusetts or New York needed to raise provincial troops, to wear the uniform of that colony and participate in these expeditions, they would go to the militias as a way of getting volunteers, right, to join in these provincial forces. So, I think most of the colonists who served in those provincial forces or were recruited directly into the British Army. Some militias were called out to defend frontiers and so forth, but their time of service was much less, and they were not serving under British officers. So I don't think there was the same demand on their time in away from home that there was on these provincial troops who were expected to march quite a distance from home, and stay enlisted for an entire campaign season.
But provincial troops were paid though, right?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Do you have any comments on the difficulty they had at the end of the war of getting back some of the women?
Yes. Well, there are a couple captivity narratives from the 7 Years' War era that do tell the stories of these female captives. One in particular, Jean Lowry, ends up on these cartel ships and has a very long, extended captivity before she's finally able to return home to Pennsylvania. So some of those captivity stories do tell that.
What about the difficulty of the women and children who did not want to come back?
Yeah, so yes, the question concerns female and child captives, forced repatriation, right? Yes, and the famous account of that comes at the end of Pontiac's War in 1763 and 1764, when the British do, now that the French had been dispossessed of Canada, the British do become increasingly dictatorial in telling Indians that if they want peace, they must repatriate all captives. And so there's about 300 captives that are forcibly repatriated by Colonel Bouquet in 1764. And that's where we get these accounts of captives who've been repatriated, who run away to rejoin their Indian families, of captive women who've been forcibly separated from Indian husbands with whom they've had children and so forth. And those are very, heart-wrenching stories. And people like Benjamin Franklin observe this and say, why is it the Indians are so successful in convincing us to go live like them when we can't convince them to live like us, right? So those stories are very interesting, but that's associated with the end of Pontiac's War. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, we're right on schedule. As we've seen by this morning, I think for the presentations given, I think the expectation from the audience is for our afternoon speakers to include some type of film or TV reference. So Jim, and Glenn, you need to think about that over lunchtime. Which, speaking of, it's lunchtime. Please be back by 1:30 and we will continue. So thank you.